already last October, there is a huge need for leadership, and not only in our congregations, but in our homes and in our communities. And I feel slightly guilty, but I'm going to be airing some dirty laundry this morning, because this is something that I think is a huge problem in the church universal. When it comes to some of the things we'll talk about, I'm going to give some reasons why I think it's such a big problem. But I hope that you guys are willing to follow along. And for the need of leadership in the congregations, how many congregations do you know of who are without elders? Wait, to be fair, I've lived in Canada, and I've lived in Florida, and Ohio, and Kentucky, and West Virginia, and I was with 2 congregations in all of my 32 years that had elders. Both of those were internships where I got to work with another preacher, and so there were larger congregations who had elders. And so respectively, 2 summers in one congregation in Ohio, and then about 10 months at another congregation in Florida. But other than that, I've spent my entire childhood and adulthood in congregations without elders. You think of how many we know of here in Virginia that have elders. I can probably name, I think, on maybe one hand that I know of congregations here in Virginia that have elders. When we lived in Canada, there was one congregation in the entire country that I knew of that had elders. And one of them passed away last fall. And so now, as far as I know, there are 0 in the entire country. I mean, this is something that, as we look at Acts chapter 14, as Paul and Barnabas came back around after their first missionary journey, they appointed elders in every town. Paul tells Titus in chapter 1 and in verse 5, "This is the reason I left you in Crete, to set in order the things that remain and to appoint elders in every city." This is God's design for the church, and yet there are so many that do not have it. The question comes up, why are there so many? And how long do congregations exist without ever appointing them? Sometimes you might know of a congregation that has been around for 40 or 50 or 60 years and have never got to that point. And why is it something that seems to bother too few people? Why are so many people feeling seemingly complacent in this? And what I want to have is a lot of questions for today. I'm not going to have all of the answers. We're going to be dealing with some of these as we go forward. I want to look at just a couple of the things that kind of go into this. I'd like to just mention briefly that business meetings don't work. I mean, that's kind of an unpopular thing, but it's not God's plan. That's the first and foremost reason why business meetings don't work. Decisions are often made by majority rather than wisdom. Now, I've been through a lot of business meetings, some of them being very short and sweet, some of them being long and like pulling teeth. And for the men who have been through business meetings, I think that we all kind of recognize that business meetings is not really how God intended them to. Business meetings are often named business meetings because they deal with the business of the congregation, either logistics of the meeting place or the time, dealing with finances, but all the things that elders are supposed to do, looking after spiritual needs of the individuals or the family, or addressing spiritual problems in the congregation, those things, to my knowledge, I have never been in a business meeting where that was the main topic. Bible classes coming up, needing an appointment for teachers, setting up things down the line of gospel meetings, dealing with finances, all of those things come up on a very regular basis. But what elders do is not what men's meetings do. So I think sometimes we forget that. Dealing with the question of why are so many without elders, again, there is no one simple answer. Anytime there is a vast, big problem and someone gives you a simple one-answer solution, then it's usually oversimplification. And I'm going to give just 3 possible reasons that this might be the case. Sometimes it's just apathy. We forget that business meetings are not what God intended, and they are not what are best for us as congregations, so we become apathetic. Well, it's been going on now for the last 10 or 15 or 20 years, and if it isn't broken, why fix it? The problem is that it is broken, and we do need to fix it. There are sometimes stubbornness. There are a lot of people who want democracy rather than a leadership. We were in a congregation years ago, had the opportunity to have elders in the congregation. And the answer that we received was a very resounding no. We simply do not want it. And I can tell you honestly, that was the day that I decided that it was time for me to find somewhere else. If there is a plan that is laid out for the church in the Bible, and that plan is an opportunity, and they no longer want it, then I feel that I have very little ability to do much past that point. It's like this was years ago and in a far different place. Sometimes it's ignorance. Many people either live most of their lives, like I have, in congregations without elders, and they either forget or they never really understand what an eldership does. And then an eldership is not there to simply conduct the business of the congregation, but their purpose is to spiritually guide individuals and families and the congregation as a whole towards heaven. And in failing to understand the true purpose, many fail to see that the congregations whose business is conducted on a regular basis is still desperately in need of something more. That we are not operating to our optimal capacity as God has designed us to. And so whether through apathy or stubbornness or ignorance, this has become a pervasive problem in the vast majority of congregations that I know of around the world. We have need for leadership at home. The divorce rate in the church has become almost identical to the divorce rates in the world. And as I was writing out the lesson, a couple questions just kind of came to mind, so I put on the page. Why is this happening? And why are we seemingly okay with it? I know that we're not actually okay with it, but this is a problem that is growing in leaps and bounds, and yet there's not a lot that's being done. And how is this not the world creeping into our congregations? If you look at the regulations or the requirements, if you will, or the character that is put forward either in 1 Timothy chapter 3 or Titus chapter 1, it's an individual who has learned how to conduct his own household well, who has a wife and believing children, individuals who have, through their example, shown what it is to have a household, a family that is operating as a Christian family should. And we had mentioned a couple weeks ago the idea of buying wisdom, of finding individuals who have the knowledge and using that. And this is one of the areas where we are just lacking in that. How to be married, how to work. Paul tells Titus in Titus chapter 2, for the older men to teach the younger men how to love their husbands and their children. For the older men to be an example in those things as well. And one of the things that congregations, whenever they lack a good leadership, they lack that vital knowledge that is passed down. We also need leadership in the home because the attrition rate of our youth is almost identical to the attrition rate in denominations. Whenever this topic comes up, I have often heard people comforting one another in this. Well, this is the way that it always is. It's the way that it is in every denomination. And I have a really hard time with that. How can we comfort each other knowing that our execution of God's plan is working out nearly as well as man's way of doing things? I mean, the attrition rate is somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 to 70%, depending on the statistics that you look at. Given that fact, I have 2 children. I don't know which one would you choose? If you know that the rate was 50 to 70%, you have 2 children. Who would you choose out of your 2 kids? If the choice was just given to you? And the answer is, well, none. I couldn't choose one. And so that rate of 50 to 70% is simply unacceptable for me. That I have to work harder, I have to do better. I need more in my life because I can't lose half my kids. So we take so much pride in not doing things like church-sponsored schools or youth basketball teams or youth pastors or campus ministries, and yet for all of our non-efforts, we are still doing about as well as everyone else is. There's something still wrong. And Proverbs chapter 22 and verse 6 is probably a passage we as parents know well. He mentions there in Proverbs 22 and verse 6, to train up a child in the way that he should go, and even when he is old, he will not depart from it. I've been told that this passage says this, but it doesn't mean this. It means that when the children grow old, they will return to the way that the parents have taught them. But what would the qualifications for an elder mean if raising godly children was just a shot in the dark and it was a gamble with no certainty of outcome? We as parents face a lot of challenges in this modern time. I think parents of all ages have always faced challenges. How many times do you see a generation of faithful individuals who the next generation becomes godless? I mean, this is a common cycle through history. And God has given us recipes and designs and patterns for us to follow. This is something that we need to work on diligently, to be leaders at home, to teach our children diligently. And we'll give some ideas and hints later on. We need leadership in our congregations. Now, I know many of us are not from Williamsburg. Some of us are. Many of us have lived different places and have been transplanted here, and sometimes we'll be transplanted somewhere else in the future. But how many congregations have you known who have split? Either congregations that you've been a part of or congregations who are neighboring and that you've been close to. Small groups, just numerically, I don't think we can afford to split. But more importantly, this isn't God's plan. We've been through 1 Corinthians not too long ago, I believe. We've been through a variety of other New Testament epistles written to congregations who have problems, congregations who have issues. You can go through Revelation chapter 2 and chapter 3 where he addresses the 7 churches of Asia who are obviously struggling. And through all of the conflict, through all of the problems, never once does any of the New Testament writers advocate for a split. In 1 John chapter 4, John is writing there of brotherly love, and he makes the point that you cannot claim to love God whom you've never seen if you hate your brother who you do see. And whenever we agree to just split, to go our separate ways, it's never amicable. Now, there's a term that we had learned of what was that? A peaceful swell, or something down that line. It was the idea that a congregation has gotten large enough, and so they've decided to some of them to start a new work. And so it wasn't a split over doctrinal or personal problems, but just we're going to continue to grow in other areas. But when it comes to conflicts, either personal or spiritual, where the congregation splits itself over an issue, those are not amicable. They're not times where people are willing to get together outside of services or even for services, where they no longer even act as brothers and sisters in Christ, let alone even friends. And 1 John chapter 4 becomes a huge, huge point there. At what point in time can we say that we still love God if we can't stand to be around our brethren? We are called to peace, and we are called to proclaim, and we do proclaim ourselves, as Paul says in Romans chapter 2, as guides the blind and light to those who are in darkness. And we claim ourselves to be instructors of the fools and the teachers of children. But we're having such issues and problems inside of our own congregations, and I'm not necessarily meaning here in Williamsburg. These are some ideas that if we do happen to be moved to other places in the future, these are important for us to take with us. Where is the leader who guards against the wolves among us? Paul pulls the Ephesian elders aside and he warns them that there will be wolves that rise among them. And how many times have we seen that where the men, as kind-hearted and as diligent as they are, lack either the experience or the knowledge or the authority, and everyone just kind of goes, I see it, but what do I do? And problems arise and are never dealt with. Where's the wise one who can be the judge between two brothers? In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, that's exactly what is happening, is that there's conflict. And Paul says, instead of taking it to court, isn't there someone who's wise enough among you to settle this and then just be done with it? Where's the one who makes peace between two who are fighting? Where's the one who, in their wisdom, defends the truth and avoids foolish arguments, like Paul talks about in 1 Timothy chapter 2 or 2 Timothy chapter 2? And then to Mark the troublemaker, as he mentions in Titus chapter 3. Where are the shepherds in our congregations? Why are there so few? Why are we never achieving that? Without leadership, the church simply does not work as it should. Many congregations simply meet every week and go through the motions. As some would say, that they just attend house or keep house. How many times do we preach to those who are already Christians, maybe even specifically in the need for baptism, or we offer the invitation to those who are saved, or conduct Bible studies for people who already know, and evangelize only to ourselves? Like I said, this isn't a direct criticism to us here in Colonial, but a general statement of kind of the church universal, that these things become prominent as a congregation loses its zeal for work. Simply tending house becomes the everyday occurrence. I think part of the problem is the type of leadership that some have had in the past. Turn with me to Matthew chapter 20. There are times where individuals who have been in congregations where the leadership is not maybe to their suiting, or maybe the leadership is not really acting as it should. And that is certainly a possibility. And so in the future times, they shy away from those things. It's like the meal that you ate right before you got the stomach flu. You never want to have that meal again. Sometimes people have that same feeling when it comes to leadership. Well, I've been there, done that, didn't like it, I'm not going to go back. But Jesus describes a different leadership than what the world usually has. Here in Matthew chapter 20, there, starting in verse 25, I remember that the mother of the sons of Zebedee came up and asked him, can my two sons sit at your right hand and at your left in the kingdom? And then on the topic of leadership, Jesus says in verse 25, he calls them to him and said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. It shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be your slave, even as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. I mean, this quality and type of leadership is really in keeping with every other Christian in their walk, how we are to conduct ourselves as individuals. But this is really an example of what leadership should be like. And Jesus, here in verse 28, gives himself as the direct example. Not to be served, but to serve. That the one who would be first must be the servant of all. And there's a really interesting pattern as you go through the Gospel of Mark, that this conversation comes up over and over and over again. It comes up when they're on the road, who's going to be first. It comes up again whenever they're reclining at table at the Last Supper. James and John discuss it directly with Jesus. And then here, the sons of Zebedee, their mother comes and talks to Jesus on their behalf. This is a conversation that happens at least 5 times in the scriptures. Who's going to be first? Who's going to be the very best? Who's going to be prominent among you? And every time Jesus turns it back around and says, you have it all backwards. That leadership is not one that is putting yourself forward, it's always putting others forward. It's a leadership that serves. And it's a leadership that isn't executed via oppression or violence. It is one of a shepherd. In 1 Peter chapter 5, Peter encourages his fellow elders, his fellow shepherds, to shepherd the flock of God that is among them, exercising oversight in verse 2, not under compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you, not for shameful gain, but eagerly, not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, he will receive the unfading crown with glory. Now, as you go over to John chapter 10, we'll get there in a few weeks in our Wednesday night Bible class, Jesus describes himself as the good shepherd, and that's what John is referencing here. Peter's referencing there in 1 Peter chapter 5. There are kind of 3 direct roles of a shepherd. One is to direct and to guide, and Peter says here, through your example and through your teaching. both in teaching and in your example. A shepherd guides and directs. Have you ever seen the little charts when it comes to leadership as opposed to bosses, where bosses are in the back driving the people forward and leadership is in the head showing the way? And that's what he describes here, is that leadership that guides through first having the example themselves and then by teaching for others to follow. The second aspect, as we look at over in the book of Acts, of the Ephesian elders, is a role of protection. The shepherd isn't there just to guide the sheep from one pasture to the next pasture, but is there to protect from all the wolves and other things that may come and prey upon them. And the third aspect is to rescue. We always think of the shepherd with his shepherd's crook. Jesus makes references to the times that animals have fallen into a pit, or the ones who have gone astray. How is the shepherd's duty to go and to bring them back? All of those aspects are extremely important and things that oftentimes we miss. At the same time, there are commands for the congregation for those who achieve this point in time. 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 5, he says, likewise, you who are younger, be subject to the elders. And in Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 7, he says to remember your leaders, those who have taught you the faith, and imitate their way of life. And the same thing in Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 21, he says, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. And not just to the elders, not to just to the leaders, but to submit to one another, that we all should have a mindset for that. So the question comes up, if we see the problem, if we see that there is a need for leadership, where do we begin? There's an old little proverb that says, let there be leadership in God's kingdom, and let it begin with me. Matthew chapter 22 begins in my personal life. Here in Matthew 22, as you look with me there in verse 37. The first in the great commandment, that you should love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first in the great commandment. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, the passage we often turn to for teaching children, he begins, before he ever deals with teaching children, that you as individuals should love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your strength. The same passage that here Jesus quotes from Matthew 22. Personal devotion has to be key. I had an elder once tell me that the number one problem with children leaving the church as they grow up is a parent's lack of love for God. He made the point that children live with their parents day in and day out, and they're almost always the first people to see if their parents' devotion is really genuine or if they're just going through the motions. I think that was just a profoundly wise statement. That individuals get to see that at a very young age, and they realize that if their parents don't really have a love for God, then they are never going to have that for themselves, or they're least or less likely. And so he said, if you want to lead, you cannot be fake or disingenuous in your faith, but you need to first and foremost love God. That if you're going to lead someone to heaven, you have to be on the path to start with. I as an individual, if I want to begin to be the solution to the problem of leadership, then I have to set an example. Paul tells this to Timothy and to Titus, both in chapter 4 of Timothy and in chapter 2 of Titus. He tells both of them individually to set the believers an example. To first practice it, and then to dictate that to others. So leadership, it begins with me in my personal life, and it begins with me in my family. In Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 23, he talks to husbands, that they have the leadership in the family, but for a purpose, not to get everything they want in life. He mentions there in verse 32, he says, this is a mystery that is profound, and I say to you that it refers to Christ and the church. And if you look, remember, I think these passages from verses 25 and following are passages we know. How Christ loved the church and nourished the church so that she could be blameless and holy and present that to God. And that is my role as a husband, is to lead my family in a way that I can nourish them and care for them and present them holy and blameless before the Lord. That's a hard task. In Genesis chapter 2, or chapter 3 rather, we have the very first sin that's recorded, where Eve is deceived and Adam, seemingly nearby, possibly watching it all, comes along, well, she didn't drop dead, so I might as well eat it too. And him not being deceived takes it. And as you get to later parts of chapter 3, he gives new rules that never allow us as husbands to ever pawn off responsibility. When God's presence is in the garden, Adam blames 2 other people for his actions. He says, well, the woman that you gave me, she gave me and I ate. And from that point forward, God says that we as husbands can never pawn off that responsibility to anybody else. And our leadership as husbands has to be one where we desire the best for our family, not what we want. And that's a hard thing to do. In 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 7, we are told to live with our wives in an understanding way, showing honor to them as the weaker vessels. Again, where we have less of ourselves and more of them. In Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 4, as fathers, he tells us to bring them up in the nurture and the discipline of the Lord. To raise them the way that God would have us to raise them. An individual I worked with for a while had posted this statement on social media. He said that I've always wanted a male life coach to help me grow up because I've never had a dad figure. Not that I'm sad because I've never had a dad in my life. I just always wanted a male mentor in my life. I feel like I would have been better. I would have been where I needed to be in my life, and I would have matured and been much stronger as a man much earlier in life. Because I feel like I have so much more growing up to do, and I'm 31 years old. I wonder how many people who have felt exactly like this and have never stated it want. Individuals who wanted a leader in their household to teach them what they needed to be taught and just simply never had it. And the numbers are climbing of individuals who simply don't have male role models, who don't have dads who are at home, who don't have the leadership and are lacking those things. And even later in life, I know that 31 isn't all that later in life. Felt like that way when I was 14, but man, 32 has really crept up quickly. But I wonder how many people feel exactly that way, that now I am supposed to be an adult and I've never had someone who really showed me what an adult is supposed to look like. Whenever comes the solution is not pointing fingers to other people, it's looking at ourselves. I have to have that personal devotion in my life. I have to lead in my family. There are some really scary statistics, and we won't dive into all of them. I'll just share a couple of them with you. In churches, and this is kind of a worldwide, in even a historic standpoint, 65% of the congregations are female. Almost always. Think of all the congregations you've attended over your life, and think of how many times the men have outnumbered the women. I can't think of a single congregation that I grew up in, or that I've been around to, where that's been the case. Where 35% are men. In a household where the mother and the father either have different religions, or the mother and the father, or one of them does not have a religion, the other one does. 83% follow the father and 17% follow the mother. In 1 Corinthians chapter 16 and verse 31, he tells us to be strong and act like men. These are hard statistics to swallow. But there are good, legitimate reasons why these are the case. But good and legitimate, you realize, I don't mean that they're actually good and legitimate, but I'm just saying that there are realistic reasons behind these statistics. And if we don't see the problem, if we don't acknowledge it, then we're not going to ever begin to be the solution. We need to be individuals who take hold of our roles that God has given us and to fill them in a godly way. Because we are given individuals in our charge, in our care, to raise and to nurture. As one person said, as parents, we really are more like guardians, or even, not adoptive parents, but adoptive parents, where our charge is to raise children for God for a time and then give them back to Him, or we're only here for a little while. Leadership begins with me in the congregation. In Romans chapter 12, after Paul has made all of his statements about why we should be so devoted and so zealous for Christ. As you look for verses 6 down through verse 9, we've looked at this passage along with 1 Peter chapter 4 a few times, where he tells us, having gifts that differ according to the grace that is given to us, let us use them. If in prophecy in proportion to our faith, if in service in our serving, the one who teaches in his teaching, the one who exhorts in his exhortation, the one who contributes in generosity, and the one who leads with zeal, and the one who does acts of mercy with cheerfulness. Peter makes the same point in 1 Peter chapter 4, there verses 10 and verse 11. He says in verse 10 that each one of us has received a gift. Use it in serving one another as good stewards of God's varied grace. Whoever speaks as the oracles of God, whoever serves as the one who serves by the strength that God supplies, in order that in everything God might be glorified through Jesus Christ. And to him belongs glory and dominion forever and ever. Amen. And part of the problem, part of the solution is for me as an individual to be active and engaged in using my gifts to the very best of my ability to serve others and to serve God. The congregations have gone so long because I, as an individual, have not engaged with the congregation as I should. That my goal as an individual should be, as a man, to work towards these things. That every time we meet together on Sundays, whenever I have an opportunity to meet outside of services or on Wednesday night Bible class, to meet purposefully and thoughtfully of what I can do to help serve and guide, and to use my gifts to God's glory. Where I don't attend just to attend, or I don't attend just to be fulfilled myself, but I attend to do something for somebody else, to fulfill my role. For men who are not in the position of an elder, to work to be qualified if that is in their ability, to work to serve, to have that desire. Paul tells Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 3, the one who desires the office of an overseer desires a good thing. That is something that we should be working for. We should encourage the younger men as they come up, that they make that a priority in their life, a goal to be reached. My father often talks about one of his cousins, that even at a young age, he stated very publicly that this is what he wants to do. He wants to find a wife that's going to help him in those roles. He wants to raise his children diligently so that he can serve a congregation in this capacity. I want to say that should be a goal that young men should have. Not all of them are going to achieve that, and that's fine. There are some things that are just going to be outside of our abilities. But all the qualities and characteristics of elders that isn't to deal with progeny or marriage, all of those things are qualities and characteristics that should be attained by all men in the congregation. We need to work for that purpose. So to summarize and to kind of condense all of this in a couple quick bullet points, the question is, what can I do? I think there's a huge lack of leadership that kind of goes across the board in the church, whether it be on a congregational level, engagement for individuals, or leadership at home. That is not something that's been put forward either in our societies and has bled over into our congregations. Once we see the need, then we need to decide to do something about it. And the first one has to be personal devotion. That if we see the need for leadership, then I have to be engaged, and I have to love God with all my heart, with all my soul, and all my strength. And my ability to bring my children to God diminishes greatly if my love for God isn't there in the first place. It's a lot easier to say, do as I say and not as I do, but it never works out that way. Very few people ever do what their parents say and not what their parents do. So if we want our children to follow us, if we want others to follow us, if we want to have a light that shines in our workplaces and light that shines in our neighborhoods, then we need to be individuals of personal devotion. We need to have personal life and personal salt. We need to engage in our families to the very best of our abilities to be leaders that serve our families, who make decisions that are best for them spiritually. We need to be personally invested and personally involved in our local congregations. When Paul writes in Romans chapter 12 and Peter writes in 1 Peter chapter 4, he's not just writing to the men of the congregation to say that you have been given a gift, therefore you use them to the best of your ability. He's writing to everybody. It says, everyone, as each one has received a gift, use it. We're going to be talking in a week or two about unusual leaders in God's kingdom. And the ones that we overlook are the ones who are quiet, the ones who lead in a very unique way. And leadership isn't always about being loud or shouty. It happens in so many variety of ways. And your personal investment, each and every one of you, is absolutely necessary. That's the point that Paul makes in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, that each one of us has been given a place inside God's body. And without you, we are lacking something. We need to start working towards leadership. Either if this is something that you see in your future or you see in someone else's future, either helping guide them in that way or you yourself developing the skills and the requirements that are necessary. We need to fulfill our role to the very best of our abilities to the glory of God, whatever position God has given us. There is so much that can be done in the local congregations. Because the problem is something that is definitely something that needs to be addressed and something that needs to change over time. Leadership is something that is necessary and something that we are lacking quite often. The invitation song number 836. We are so used to the idea of democracy that sometimes we want democracy when it comes to our relationship with God. We think of peace as being something that we sit down at a table and we negotiate terms and we work out. And the Bible has a different perception of how peace is portrayed. Peace is made between us and God when we are fully and completely under God's control. It's not a way that we really like thinking about it. It's not something that we like to consider often. But that is the case. That we have taken control of our lives and we have ruined them through sin. We have made choices that draw us away from God and draw us away from others, corrupting our hearts and corrupting our minds. And the only way that can be corrected is not by negotiation, but complete and utter devotion to God. And if you've been swayed away from that, if you've been lacking in those areas, if you've been struggling in bringing back your own will into your life and not giving that over to God, please let us know as we stand and sing number 836.
What will you do with Jesus?